Hello everyone. Today is the first in a series of sessions covering what business structure do I need to sell on Amazon, particularly for people in the US. We are joined today with Jason McDonald from Intrepid Advisory, and he's going to talk about this from probably, I suppose, the Australian residents' perspective. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, look, do you want to just firstly tell us a little bit about yourself and Intrepid Advisory for those that don't know?
Sure, no worries. So, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Intrepid Advisory, and we are accountants that specialize in e-commerce. And in particular, we've got a fairly strong base of Amazon sellers. So, mainly, Australian-based Amazon sellers who are selling in overseas marketplaces. And we help them with a variety of services such as bookkeeping, taxation structuring, which we're going to talk about today, and grants.
Look, I think a lot of people, we get so many people coming and asking us how they should, do all this sort of,
Mm,
I suppose, and it's pretty important. I mean, you start off selling on Amazon or in your e-commerce, and then you think, oh, what should have I
mm,
done? So we'll try and help
mm.
those that, are starting out. So look, to begin with, I suppose, do you want to just tell us what is an LLC?
Sure. So it does get mentioned a lot, particularly with the education providers who are from the US. So an LLC is a US form of a limited liability company. So it's a type of entity that's registered in a particular state in the United States. Now, for our Australian-based listeners, um, the features of an LLC are a bit different to what you would typically, associate with a company in Australia. And the main difference is that the taxation of an LLC is quite different. So the taxation of an LLC, typically an LLC is structured or registered such that the actual entity itself doesn't pay the tax. Rather, the members, or what we'd call the shareholders, are actually liable for the taxation. So it's a special, it's a unique feature of an LLC that we don't really, we don't really have the same company structure in Australia. So that's basically what
Okay.
an LLC is. It's a US type of company.
Company. Okay. So let's,
Yeah.
a good bit of information for people.
Mm,
And look, and I
mm,
know myself and I know quite a few others that don't actually sell through an LLC. So is it
mm.
necessary to actually have an LLC in the US, or do you advise it? What's your
Yeah.
take on
Okay.
that?
So let's like take a step back. So why do you want an LLC or something in place of an LLC if it's not going to be an LLC? And it's to limit your liability. So if you don't have a company in place, the function of a company is to limit your liability. You are potentially exposed then for any liability of your business. So if someone's going to get sued, it's going to be you personally. So if something goes wrong with your products, or if some regulatory risk arises, you're personally liable. So the function of a company is then to act as that shield. So it's there in place to take on any liability. So
Okay.
the question then is, do you need an LLC to do that? Well, the answer is patently no from an Australian seller's perspective, because you and I are aware that there's lots of sellers out there who, the vast majority, are not selling through an LLC. So my general recommendation is I wouldn't say to avoid it at all costs, but it's an unnecessary complication without much benefit. Okay, so the strict
Okay.
answer is no, you don't need one to sell in the US marketplace. So you can do that through an Australian structure, which we can kind of dive into a bit later on. But there might be some circumstances where an LLC makes sense. And this is where it's generally a commercial decision. So it's not a decision that's either tax driven one out of necessity. It's one for various commercial factors. Okay, so
Okay.
you might want an LLC, for instance, if you've got another investor who is a US investor. Okay, so it might make sense to invest with an LLC. It might make sense to have an LLC if you want to get finance in the US. So to get inventory finance, the options for Australian sellers are now very limited.
Okay.
So a lot of the providers who were providing inventory finance have pulled out of the Australian market, and they now require you to have an LLC. Okay.
Mm.
Another reason might be for insurance purposes. So insurance is generally cheaper um, when it's through an LLC for the US market. But what you need to do is, weigh up, well, the additional costs of having an LLC versus these benefits. It's going to be a cost benefit analysis, because
Right. Yeah.
the LLC is all it's doing is what it's doing is adding another layer of structure for you as an Australian. Okay, because typically
Yeah.
you're going to have a yeah. mm. So that
Do you want to maybe
so
just explain the tax treaty part of it with, like, do people
yeah
pay tax in the US with the LLC? Then do they pay it here? How does that particular
yeah
section work? Make
yeah
it clear for
yeah
people.
yeah. So the tax treaty, we tend to be a bit agnostic as to your structure. What the tax treaty does is it says, well, let's say you've got, bearing in mind, you got with an LLC, you would typically structure your LLC so the LLC doesn't pay the tax, the member does. Okay, so the
Oh,
shareholder will be based in Australia, and same with an Australian company. So Australian company, you're based in Australia, but selling in the US market. What the tax treaty does, it says, well, two jurisdictions are potentially fighting over who gets the right to tax the income. So you got US sourced income. So yeah, the United States is saying, well, that's taxable, and then you got the Australian side saying, well, that's taxable because you're Australian resident. And what the tax treaty does is it puts a rule in to say, well, the US can tax it in circumstances, and Australia will tax it in other circumstances. And the general principle is that any profits that an Australian company or an Australian member of an LLC make in the US are going to be only taxable in Australia. Okay, so it's what we call, it's a
oh, yeah.
tiebreaker. So those profits are taxable in Australia unless certain conditions are met that make it taxable in America. So those certain conditions might be that you have
Oh,
an employee in America, or you actually have a physical presence in America, such as your own warehouse or a retail store. Okay, and that's called what we call a permanent establishment. Okay, so if you've got some permanency
so yes, it
in the
gets a bit
United States,
complicated, doesn't it?
yeah, it does. But fortunately, fortunately for most people, the model is that you don't have that degree of permanency in America.
Yeah.
And so
So,
in 99% of the circumstances, most of the profits are going to be taxable in Australia. Okay.
right.
Uh,
Yep.
and that's subject to some overriders as well. So you still need to maintain your compliance with lodging the right forms in the US. So in the US, in order to get the benefit of the treaty, you still need to lodge a US tax return, for instance, from a technical perspective.
Right.
So for most sellers, it's what we
Okay.
call
Right.
Form 1120F, which a lot of Amazon sellers will be familiar with. But that's lodged in order to get the benefit of the treaty. That's a technical requirement that the United
Okay.
States government has placed under the treaty. Yeah, so that's how the treaty works. Basically,
Yep. All
makes
right.
it taxable in Australia
How it
only.
works. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and so, like, it seems that it's not, strictly necessary. So are there any real major benefits in having an LLC for people from here?
Look, yeah, typically not. There's probably more downside risk than upside risk. So the reason why I say it's more downside risk is because it's additional costs, because these aren't cheap to maintain. because invariably you're going to have to get like a US CPA involved or a US tax filing agent, and nothing to do with taxes is cheap in the US. So you got that kind of additional level of complexity to it, and there's no real tax benefit either. So we just kind of
Right.
demonstrated that look, the tax is going to come back to Australia anyway, so there's no real tax reason. So the benefit of having an LLC, it's really if one of those overriding commercial circumstances
Right.
requires you to have one.
Okay.
So if you've got a co-investor, if you're looking to finance, um, another reason why it might be, and this depends on your business model as well. Some suppliers, so if your suppliers in the US, it might open up the opportunity to deal with US suppliers because a US supplier might only deal with registered US entities.
Right.
So they
Okay.
might require you to have an LLC in order to, uh, to be able to be, to get a contract with them.
What about if
Okay.
you wanted to sell a brand down the track? Does that help with this? You trying to sell, or is that not important?
Yeah, generally not. It's generally not particularly relevant. So when you're selling the brand, the buyer is buying your business assets.
Yeah.
So they're not buying your company, they're not buying your legal structure. All they're really interested in is, well, you know, let's identify who owns it, but I really don't care who owns it. So, because what's really important for me is that I get, ownership of your assets, and that's going to be, your IP, the keys to your Amazon store, and your inventory.
Okay.
So, generally, look, generally again, probably don't really care who it is. If anything, um, yeah, it might be, for them, most buyers have a degree of sophistication about them. They will have advisors behind them, so it's not something to be scared of.
Okie dokie. So, what do you suggest for people, like particularly from Australia or even maybe New Zealand, to how to
Mm.
structure instead of having an LLC? What structure should people, start when they're starting out? What do you advise them to do? And I know this will vary between people, but it's a
Yeah.
broad blanket
Okay.
conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. So generally, it depends. So it depends on your personal circumstances. So that's probably the overriding thing. But when you're looking at what structure is best suitable for me, and that structure is going to be for me might be different to you, Margaret. There's three principles that you need to look at. Okay, so the first principle we've already discussed. So you want something that limits your liability. Okay, so that if something goes wrong, you're not being sued personally. It's you know the other entity, and typically a company is what achieves that. So bare minimum, there's going to be some sort of like corporate entity in the structure. Okay, and that's purely there to limit your liability. Okay, that's the function of a company. The second kind of criteria that you want to look at is asset protection. Okay, so asset protection is quite a broad term, but there's two types of assets that you want to protect. So one is the assets that you already have, you already own. Okay, so you might own your family home, for instance. You might already have an existing business. Okay, but the one thing I like to, I guess, raise with sellers is your biggest asset in as a seller is actually your brand. Okay, so the value of your business is intrinsic in the brand. So your brand is encapsulated by the IP. So that's typically your trademarks, um, your patents, your copyright, and your goodwill, for instance. Okay, so you want to make sure that in your structure you may not have any. You might when you're starting out, it's probably not an issue because you don't have you know a brand to protect per se. You might just be selling a few products. But as you grow, your brand is going to bloom, hopefully. You want to make sure that that's protected. So asset protection is another sort of a limb that you need to consider with your structure. And then the third criteria is taxation. So, and again, this is why it's different for every seller. So, what structure is going to provide the most flexibility, or the most or future-proof your position, both in terms of ongoing profits, so that the tax leakage on your ongoing profits, you're not paying more tax than you need to, but also on exit. So you want to keep, eye on the prize. And generally for most sellers, payday is generally when you sell the business. So what structure is going to facilitate, um, the less tax leakage when you come to, come to sell your brand. Okay.
Okay, yep.
Yeah. So I can't answer that from a New Zealand perspective, but
It's a bit
generally
different.
from from an Australian perspective, look, we can generally structure things so that you're only paying tax at around 11% on exit.
Right. Oh,
Okay,
that's, yeah,
so that's
that
something
makes it
to keep in mind.
a bit nicer, doesn't it? than
Yeah,
paying it the
yeah,
normal Australian
yeah,
tax rates.
yeah.
Just
But that's yeah. So if so, I guess for to answer your question for a new seller, look, the very bare basic, you'd want a company that's going to that's going to achieve your limited liability, but it's not going to provide asset protection, and a company on its own is not going to provide the optimal taxation structure for you. So
okay.
there's a point where, yeah, you structure, you either set up your structure so that it can, you know, grow with you as you grow, or you can set up right from the start. But generally, you need to talk to an advisor to get the right structure that's best for your circumstances.
Okay, okay. Yeah, no, that's good. So,
Yeah,
look, what is sort of
yeah,
probably the biggest mistakes that you see sellers making, with their business structure? And can it be fixed if they've
okay,
gone down the wrong track?
yeah. Well, I guess the biggest mistake is either maybe not getting advice when they set up their structure to begin with. Setting up an LLC, for instance. Setting up an LLC is actually a big mistake I see some people make. So, and we do restructure people out of LLCs. And the reason why I say it's a mistake is, well, it doesn't add any functionality to what you need, to what you could have in Australia, and it does cause a lot of stress. So dealing with the IRS, maintaining your compliance with the IRS, it's just seems a bit heightened.
Yeah,
The IRS is a bit scarier than the ATO, so it does cause, to some extent, some paralysis with sellers I've seen. Um, Setting up, another reason why you don't want an LLC is it kind of, well, it makes getting export grants a lot harder, um, because um, yeah, the grant applications can only be made by an Australian-based resident, so an LLC
yeah,
isn't.
right.
I guess, look, the biggest mistakes I see is um, setting up your structure, um, a fairly simple, unsophisticated structure. So, say a company to begin with, like you bare basics, yeah, when you start out,
Yeah,
but not reviewing that, or um, not growing that structure's level of sophistication as your business needs grow. So you might hedge your bets and go, okay, well, I'll just have a company, so I'm not sure whether this is going to work or not.
yeah,
And then all of a sudden your business takes off. But that's not the best structure for you if you're now a seven-figure seller, or if you're doing
right.
even six figures. Okay. And the reason why, I'll explain why. Um, I like to use extreme analogies, yeah, because they're memorable. So if you've just got a company, um, the company's designed to limit your liability. So it's a bit like, you're familiar with Chernobyl. So Chernobyl was the nuclear. I'm
Yeah,
probably don't need to explain what Chernobyl is, but Chernobyl was the nuclear power plant accident in Ukraine in the in the 80s. What they've done is they've contained the fallout, the contamination. They've built this huge shelter around it. So that's essentially, a bit like a company. So you've got this company structure, which is your shield, and it's basically there to keep all the potential contamination of your business. So by contamination, I mean, liabilities. So you might have, potential liabilities with regulators. You might have potential liability with, your supplier, with Amazon itself. Someone might want to try and sue you. So that's really the purpose of a company. It's this containment shield.
Right.
But people are running their entire business through it. In particular, like I said before, the ownership of their brand is then within this, contaminated shield. So this is where we get a bit of irony in the sense that you've set up the structure to contaminate nuclear waste, but then all of a sudden your one of your biggest assets is also in that containment field. So that's probably the biggest mistake that I see, is that using the same structure to do two things: one, to limit liability, but then also to house your major assets. Your major assets being your brand.
Right.
So
Okay.
the one thing I can, suggest people to do is, well, if you've moved beyond that initial phase as a seller, so just if you've got some rhythm behind you, if you're starting to get sales and you think, yeah, I've got potential here of a brand that I want to sell, you probably should review your structure, because it may not be serving its purpose anymore. Okay, so that would
Okie
probably
dokie.
be,
Yeah, nice.
yeah, that'd probably be the biggest kind
Yeah.
of mistake that I see people make. Yeah,
Yeah, and look,
and
I
then there's
mean,
like a few. Yeah,
this isn't obviously a general advice for everyone. I mean, I think nearly every person has got some sort of different situation. Some people might have a full time job still, some people might have other businesses. There can be lots and lots of things that come into play in this, I gather. So I think, everyone should take on board what you've said. And if they would like some more advice, I suggest that perhaps if they like to, contact you and, maybe, get a little bit, more personal advice. I've actually just put your website
oh,
up there, and
there it
people can
is.
just contact you through that. And
Very,
we'll also put it in the notes as well. So, but I think, this is just to give people, I think, a general idea. And what we're hoping to do is we will be interviewing someone from the US who can talk a little bit more in depth about LLCs, if you want to go down that track, or for our US members. And we'll then move on and do some UK stuff as well. So we're just trying to give people a little bit more, advice, because it's a question that comes up nearly every week from somebody. Should I have this? Should I have that? And well, it's as even for
yeah,
yourself, it is not a straightforward answer. There's no yes, this is exactly the way that everyone should do it. So I think it's something that people can come back to you and get some advice on. And I mean, you can then. I know you do a lot of work with grants for people in Australia, so that's another bit of a bonus. By having a chat to you, you might be eligible for a
yeah,
grant as well.
yeah,
So there is a lot of
yeah. Yeah, feel free to reach out. There's a contact form on the website. That's probably the best way to get time in my calendar. So I'll have always offer like a free chat with people. And I basically just do a quick diagnosis of where you're at as a seller, and what I think you might be missing, or what I think, identify what mistakes you might have made, and what's the best path to remedy that and to correct that for you, and also what opportunities are there for you in terms of
okay.
grants or saving on tax as well.
Fantastic. Well, look, that's really good, Jason. I'm sure that people have got some information and things that they didn't understand or know from this,
Yeah,
little chat. So, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, because I know you're a busy man, and
yeah.
hopefully we'll see you around the trap somewhere shortly.
No worries.
Okay.
It's
Thanks
been
a lot,
a pleasure,
Jason.
Margaret. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.